For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sheena Thompson. I'm one of the board members for the IARCC, and on behalf of the board, we welcome you to this webinar. I would just like to thank our South African English-speaking ambassador, Niran Naidu, who has brought to us our specialist speaker today. Niran, if you're on, can you just pop your camera on and give us a wave so people know who you are and what you look like? Hi there. So he is the country representative and national ambassador for the IARCC or IARC in South Africa. So if you have anybody that's thinking of joining the institute or the association, if they would like to contact him for South Africa, but any other members or potential members, you can obviously just contact us through the normal channels. So once again, thank you very much, Niran, for bringing our representative. Now, Niran is a partner at Hewers, which is a dedicated crisis communications and reputation risk management consultancy. And I'm delighted to introduce one of his partners as our specialist speaker today. That is Dr. Dominik Heil, who, just give us a wave, Dominik. So he's both an academic and a practitioner in the field of strategy, leadership and reputation, and he has a fascinating talk for us just about to start. He's absolutely passionate about exploring some of the fundamental assumptions of current management practice in a way that makes a tangible difference to organizations' performance, and it's something which has obviously come under a lot of scrutiny at the moment. He's been an associate tutor at the Praxis Centre at the Cranfield Institute of Management for over 8 years now, so he comes from a very good perspective. But he's also has extensive consulting experience through his partnership at Hewers, and he's been working with many of South Africa's largest corporations and a number of multinationals at board level and ExCo level. So today, as I say, Dominik's got a fascinating presentation, and I think without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Dominik.
Thank you so much, Sheena, and thank you everyone for attending this session. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'll give you an overview of what we're doing today by way of an example that is familiar to, I think, all of you. And that is the Boeing 737 MAX disaster. So as you will know, in October 2018, a Boeing 737 MAX crashes in Indonesia. An aircraft manufacturer of the size of Boeing obviously is prepared for something like this, because with thousands of takeoffs and landings every day, you have to expect that something goes wrong somewhere, even if it's none of your own fault. And so if you look at this crash, it was handled the way a communications professional would handle it, well handled, all sort of according to standard. But then 5 months later, another 737 MAX crashes over and above the 183 deaths in Indonesia. You have now 157 deaths on that flight in Ethiopia. And again, the organization manages this crash in the way that a professional communications department would manage this. But obviously, because it happens the second time, it raises certain questions. The conversation moves from the shock of the incident towards questions about technological shortcomings. So that leads then to a grounding of the fleet. And even that would be a relatively manageable situation. But what then comes to the fore are deeper cultural issues, where over time we find out that the organization has moved from a traditionally really strong safety focus from its inception to starting to adopt a more commercial focus with the merger with McDonnell Douglas. And so for the last 20 years, the organization has moved from a focus on safety to a commercial focus with corners being cut. And suddenly it appears that this accident is actually not genuinely an accident. It was, given the shift in the culture, a a problem waiting to, a sort of a catastrophe waiting to happen. And that is when it becomes unmanageable. Obviously, gross negligence by the executives, the CEO, to let the culture move in that direction. Now it becomes unmanageable. It is being treated as a crime. The efforts to communicate are being seen as part of just a cover up to sort of fudge the message. And any normal organization that has that kind of incident would now cease to exist. And Boeing is lucky that it plays the strategic role in the overall US economy, that the government steps in and saves them. But certainly from a communications point of view, from a risk management point of view, we need to ask ourselves as communications managers, as risk managers, how do we deal with that kind of a risk? Because obviously once it moves too far, you can't salvage it anymore. So let me just open the presentation. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. And so if you look at reputation risks, they pretty much always appear among the top 10 when you look at the surveys of CEOs, executives, of what the core risks are. You will all have heard that reputation risk is described as the risk of all risks. And I suppose as we go into now a more turbulent environment, these kinds of issues will come to the fore more often. And so it's clear that we need a much more sort of sophisticated approach on how to identify those reputation risks, assess them, and really manage them properly. So if I look at my experience of working with lots of companies and also looking at lots of risk registers, you see that it's not really well handled. So how that usually sort of shows up is it's either mentioned as a line item, but in really general terms. And what that leads to is the response is also general. Like you then say, you know, there is reputation risk, and what we are doing is we're giving people ethics training, or we improve compliance. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with doing ethics training and improving compliance. But the problem is that that does not really identify and assess these specific reputation risks well enough so that you can properly integrate them into a risk register. Then I see sometimes it's completely omitted, despite the fact that people know that it's a major risk, or risk managers say, well, it actually shouldn't be a line item, it should be a column in our risk register, where we're saying, okay, well, reputation crises come from some event, and therefore we need to look at what are the risks in the risk register, and we say there is a reputational element to all of this. What looking at reputation risk that way does, though, is we are looking at the broad risk, and we sort of look at how we can ensure that risk and all those things that we typically do with risks. And then risk management just becomes a sort of a reactive thing that you need to do when one of those events occur. And Sheena has introduced me to the nice term called panic management, which is what's then happening. And obviously, as we, for example, see with the Boeing example, even if you do that well, it's not good enough. And also, if you look at reputation risk that way, you often can't identify what I call pure reputation risks. So those are risks that do not necessarily come with a catastrophic event of some sort. I'll give you an example. I've worked with a company that made lots of noise about innovation, especially around green technologies, and created lots of expectations there. And it wasn't like there was some catastrophe or anything like that. It was merely that none of it was really delivered. And the people actually inside the organization were already saying, well, yes, there are some people doing something, but it's not a sort of a major strategic thrust, and therefore, it wasn't delivered, and you could see that expectations that were created were disappointed and the reputation got damaged over time. So how do we deal with this? Now, I'm introducing you to a couple of core thoughts of how I've learned to think about reputation risk. And the first big point that I want to make is that reputation risk cannot be transferred. In other words, you can't sort of give it to someone else. Typically, organizations do that in the form of buying insurance, where you say, I'm buying insurance, and so I have someone else deal with it. And why do I say reputation risk can't be transferred? Well, firstly, it's really difficult to look at how do I assess this? If you, for example, have a reputation crisis and the share price tanks, how do you assess how big the damage was? It may sort of tank immediately after the crisis occurs, but then let's say it recovers over 6 months' time. What's the damage? Was there really any damage? Depends on at what time you're looking at. And of course, it's also difficult to see if your share price does certain things, to what degree is this really a function of the reputation crisis. Then it's really difficult to assess the effects of reputation crisis in other areas. Let's say you have a really committed supplier who is very proud to be your supplier, even mentions that in the public space, and therefore gives you the best service that they can possibly give you. Now the reputation crisis hits, they are now embarrassed to be your supplier. Rather than giving you the best, they give you sort of just enough to fulfill their contractual obligations. The effects on the company are significant, but how do you assess this? Then there's another element, is if you look at reputation crisis, the damage depends a lot on how the organization responds to the crisis. Some responses are so poor that they make the damage much worse than if you did nothing or little. And in other cases, the response is so good that you don't only just avert the reputation damage, you actually improve the reputation. So the classic example there is Perrier, where they find some traces of some harmful substance in their mineral water, and they have such a fantastic response by taking all the water off the shelf, replacing it, that people are super impressed by them, and their reputation actually improves by handling this crisis really, really well. So what I'm saying is also important for what I'm going to in the rest of this talk, is because the way to manage reputation, to analyze reputation risk, is really to manage it, not to give it to someone else, not to quantify it, because I suggest that that's impossible. Even if someone offers you insurance, it's either only for a specific element of the damage that is being done, or it's really questionable. So what we're talking about is, how do I now hold a baby that I cannot give to someone else? Then my actual original background is in strategy, and I've studied strategy, I've done my PhD in strategy, I've consulted widely in strategy, and I only came later to the reputation game. And so I've looked at reputation, therefore not just as a separate issue, but that if you really want to understand reputation and how to manage it, it's clear to me that you cannot manage it in isolation, but it depends on strategy, because a good reputation for one organization is not a good reputation for another. It depends on the business, the strategy, the kind of collaboration, behavior, engagement that you need from your stakeholders. And that can be quite different from company to company. And therefore, what a good reputation is can really only be assessed from a strategic perspective. And then with all the companies that I worked is I've found that over and over again, you build your reputation only to be kicked in the back by some cultural issue that then disappoints people. So you can't build a reputation really that's independent of what the culture backs up. So this old saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast can now be extended, and we can see that culture actually eats reputation for breakfast, and reputation eats strategy for breakfast as well. So we need to manage all these together, and at Hewers we've developed a diagnostic that really brings those together, and a part of that diagnostic led us to understand reputation risk in a different way. And let me explain to you sort of the starting point for how we think about this. So here on this display, you see on the horizontal culture and internal factors, which is in an organization sort of just in simple terms, either bad or good, though bad or good, again, from a strategic perspective, what is a good culture for one organization could be a bad culture for another, depending on what you're trying to do. And the same thing is with reputation. We need to look at it from the specific strategic requirements. Now, if you're a communication manager and your task is to look after reputation, you obviously typically have very little, if any, influence over culture. And what you're therefore doing is improve that sort of reputation rating of your organization. What you're doing, though, if you do this in a way that divorces that reputation from the culture, is you're putting the organization at risk. You're creating expectations that are likely to be disappointed. And the more you build that reputation, the higher the likelihood. And this starting point gives us now an access to understanding the likelihood of a reputation crisis in a certain area. So if that internal orientation commitment is too divorced from the external expectations that are being created, then you have a reputation risk whose likelihood increases to the degree that those diverge. And obviously we can assess this, and therefore we have one really important aspect of creating a reputation risk matrix, where, I mean, here normal risk matrix, every risk manager has this as a sort of staple diet, so to speak. We have now the conceptual idea of how you assess the likelihood of a reputation risk. And obviously any sort of good reputation analysis would give you an idea of what that impact is, though, you know, to mention it again, most surveys look at this in a generic way, and that's not really necessarily helpful and can sometimes be misleading. You need to look at what is the impact on those specific things that matter from a strategic point of view. So I'm going to give you an example now of how we do this, and I use a study that where I did the risk analysis 5 years ago for about South Africa. You will understand that for confidentiality reasons, I can't give you any example of my corporate work, but this work was done, published, the data is all in the public domain, even that risk analysis is in the public domain. And so what we've analyzed there is the perception difference, external versus internal. So one of maybe the two most important things that we have identified there as reputation risks are perceptions about ethics, transparency, and corruption, and effective government. So in 2017, you may remember that Jacob Zuma at that time was firmly in power. The global community was still sort of seeing South Africa as the country who had a peaceful transition to democracy, lead with very high moral credibility, had pulled off a really great soccer World Cup, and therefore these perceptions of high ethics, transparency, and effective government. But we could see from interviewing and collecting data from South Africans themselves that they say, well, that's actually not the case. The government is corrupt, is not transparent, is not ethical, and it's not effective. And you can see when this gap between internal and external perceptions gets bigger, the risk, that's how you identify the risk. So the second step then in analyzing that reputation risk is here to juxtapose this with the impact. So here on the horizontal, you still have the same data points that we had in the previous slide, where you can see here ethical country with high transparency and low corruption and effective government are all the way to the right-hand side. On the positive side, there were issues around South Africa being a friendly, welcoming, beautiful country where the international community had not noticed what South Africa has to offer. So in that analysis, you also see the areas where you can actually justifiably build a strong and sustainable reputation. But certainly these issues here were highlighted, and if we then use this to juxtapose a risk matrix, here you can see that these two risks were identified as the core risks. And as it happened, these were exactly the things that about half a year later really damaged South Africa's reputation in a major way. Email leaks came out that exposed a large part of the corruption and what's in South Africa called state capture. Bell Pottinger, who was involved as the London-based PR agency to work with the government, disappeared because they were seen as doing unethical things to protect their reputation or create certain impressions in the public. A whole bunch of other organizations were involved in this. The issue made it to the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. And so you could then see, if you tracked South Africa's reputation going forward, these were the things that really dragged South Africa's reputation down in a major way. And so you can see how an analysis like this, especially when the discrepancies become so big, then you would be able to actually identify what's likely to come. And the same would also happen if you would have done such an analysis for Boeing in 2017. You could have seen that people outside saw Boeing as a safe company, while people inside were saying this is actually no longer true, and therefore you would have been in a much better position to alert people to the risk, do something about it, get much more prepared, and do all the things that you do with good risk management. Now, if you look at a normal risk management process, what you see, what we've done so far is we've identified and we've assessed reputation risks. So here you can see the result of that as an example. If you now, the logical next steps are to say, how do we manage that risk? And obviously, I won't get into that because that very much depends on the specific risks that we are looking at. And so, I can't make general comments about that. But what I can make general comments about is how you then monitor and track those risks. How do you make sure that you pick up early if something goes wrong? Now, the first obviously big input to that is to identify those areas here where you can see these areas we need to monitor. And this is where social media is great. So social media is really problematic if you think you can understand your reputation through social media, but it's because it's not a representative sample. But it is really great if you want to pick up early developments. So if there is a conversation around those topics that have been identified as risks, then obviously on social media, you can pick them up in real time quite quickly. So that's the one aspect of monitoring and tracking these reputation risks. And the second thing is that you need to do an analysis of how your relationship to your stakeholders actually work. Now, this is an anonymized example of an airport where I looked at how important are various dimensions of that relationship that stakeholders have with the company in driving that reputation, driving not just the reputation sort of in a general way, but in that specific way that is strategically required. And there you look at, so this graph just shows you not how well the organization is doing in those things, but how important those dimensions are. Now you can see here that feeling well is really important, which intuitively makes sense. If you look at an airport, you want to feel well when you're there. You're usually stressed, you want to be taken care of, you want to be understood. You want to see that the organization is geared to making a contribution towards people and that people are delighted, while the things that typically are highlighted in a sort of a generic way of understanding reputation, which are sort of things like good reputation, good feeling. The favorite is usually trust or admiration and respect. Here, don't give you such a good idea. So that ultimately means if you measure those, you get something. So you can still see here, they have a correlation to the behaviors that you need, but not nearly as well as if you understand that relationship for your organization specifically here. You could just track whether people feel well, and you would have a very good idea when that goes up or down, whether your reputation overall is in trouble. Now, let me sort of summarize. If you analyze reputation that way, then it really can be managed like any other risks. As I said, reputation in your risk register should both be a column item and a line item, because obviously you want to know what the reputational import of your existing risks are, but also there are risks that are reputational on their own. And therefore, it should be a line item where you really look at what are those specific things that are important for your reputation. To then respond to a reputation crisis, obviously you need to be well prepared. And you can only prepare for a few risks. You can't prepare for 50, or then you will probably not do such a good job. In my experience, in a reputation risk analysis, you usually get 2 or 3 really core risks. And if you have identified them, then you are much better able to pour resources, time, money, energy into preparing for this. And usually my experience is also when you then prepare for those 2 or 3 core risks, you're also much better prepared for all others if you do a really good job in preparing for those 3. Obviously, you see that preparation is really key, understanding those things early on. Therefore, the theme is to fix the roof while the sun shines and be prepared. And everyone who manages crisis knows full well, if you're prepared and the panic starts, then at least you don't have to think, which is really difficult in a crisis, but you have a plan. You maybe just need to adjust it to the specific needs. And obviously that makes it a lot more manageable. And then, as I said, there is a need for developing bespoke tracking tools, which that analysis really allows you to do, so that you can pick up early when things are happening and not when they're already in full swing. So I suppose if I want to summarize what I've said is, if you want reputation risk management to work, there really needs to be a collaboration between the communicators and the risk managers. They can empower each other, make sure that those risks are properly understood, managed. They can give each other credibility and support in in managing those. And then also it gives both risk managers and communicators a much more strategic role rather than a support role. So thank you. Sheena, I'm handing back over to you.
On behalf of the board at the IARCC, thank you very much, Dominik, for your time and for sharing all your insights. It's been a wonderful presentation. I certainly picked up a lot, and it's really great to see that risk management is now getting very fully connected to risk communications. It's very much the way to go in my view, and that sort of comes from my military background. You have to be totally integrated into that process. I'd also just like to have another plug for our membership. Please do visit our website if you're interested in joining the IARCC. We are advancing the profession, and we are sharing and collaborating, and we are moving ahead with everything that we're doing. So I really would encourage you to join. And I think yeah, that sort of concludes it. Let me just have a look. Oh, Philip wants to have a group picture. If anybody is willing to be on the group picture screenshot, if you could pop on your screens. Do we have any others?
And by the way, if anyone wants to explore any of those questions any further, feel free to reach out to me either via the Hewers website.
I will be. No, it's absolutely fascinating. It really is music to my ears. I think risk management is often seen as quite a dry function, but it's absolutely critical to what we do, because we're usually at the other end of when risks aren't managed properly, or they are managed properly. Yeah, lots of thank you messages coming through in the chat there, Dominik.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
All right, and that concludes the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.